When working with structural steel bolts, especially TC or tension control bolts, it's important to understand how the field actually installs those bolts and whether or not there's clearance to install those bolts, especially when it comes to tension control bolts. If you see here at the image at the upper left hand corner, you can see the TC gun or electric wrench. You'll see that it's fairly large in dimensions based on the image shown at the lower right. You'll also notice that on the bolt itself, on a tension control bolt, there's an extra spline, which is at the end of the bolt near the nut side, so away from the head. That's basically on the bolt, and the TC gun or TC wrench will actually chop this off or sort of like pop it off after the bolt is fully tensioned in the field. However, from an installation point of view and whether or not there's enough clearance to install the length of that bolt from a certain direction, it's important to understand that spline length is also included. The Tekla Structures 3D model doesn't include this spline length in the visual display of the bolt, and so it can be sometimes misleading whether or not there's enough clearance to install the bolt. One other thing that's also important to understand about bolt installation, especially with TC bolts, is that a TC or tension control bolt is always tightened from the nut side, which is exactly what we see in the image at the upper left. So in this particular case here, the bolt itself would have been installed from underneath these plates and stuck through the holes and then tightened from this top side. So this is important to understand in the installation and of how the field is going to do these bolts in relationship to how you're going to detail things in the model. Here we have a wide flange brace that is fully bolted. We'll see that there's fairly large bolts here. If we actually click on this, we'll see that this is 1 1/8" diameter A490 tension control bolts that are in a slip critical condition. Now, when we look at this, you'll see that there are bolts here at the web as well as at the flange. And the gusset plate, as well as these fin plates here, are going to be shop attached to the beam assembly. So we need to make sure that this bolt can be inserted in this spot here, especially with this field applied flange plate, and then also whether or not it can be tightened. So we need to determine, can it be installed from underneath here, or can it be installed from within the brace, and then is there enough room or clearance to actually tighten this bolt. To help us review this, we've created a tool called Bolt Clearance Check. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here to the Application Components panel, and we're going to go underneath the JMT Tools group, and there's a Bolt Clearance Check. Now this is a plugin, so it's parametric. So all we need to do is single click on it, and then it's going to prompt us to pick a bolt here at the lower left hand corner. So we'll just go ahead and pick on a bolt, and then it says pick the points. So the reason why we're picking the points is we're trying to say where is the head of the bolt going to be in order to show the installation or clearance direction. Now before we do this, I'm going to go ahead and double click and open up the dialog box because there's two different options here. There's the ability to check the clearance based on bolt insertion or actually looking at the wrench. Now you're going to potentially do both, where we're going to show the bolt on one side and then the electronic wrench on the other. If we choose the wrench clearance option, you'll see that the image changes and it shows a bunch of different fields that you can fill in based on the size of the TC gun or the heavy hex electronic wrench that you're actually working with. And in the case that you can actually do a hand-driven wrench, like in really tight conditions, then essentially you can fill in some of those dimensions as well. Let's go ahead and start with bolt insertion. Now on bolt insertion, there's the ability to tell it how do you want to align the bolt. Do you want it to be based on the actual direction of the bolt and the way it's oriented in the model? Or do you want it to follow two specific points that you pick? So you have the choice to do either one. Now at the lower left hand corner, again Tekla is saying pick the bolt. So let's go ahead and pick this bolt here. Then what it says is pick the points. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick the first point and then the second point, which is going to determine how or which direction we're inserting this from. So I'm going to pick here and then the second point, and you'll see here that this bolt will not be able to clear from this specific location that I've actually put on. Now you could technically have this plate sort of like inside of the near the head of the bolt as you're inserting it. So maybe actually having it at the face is kind of wrong here. So let's go ahead and select on the plugin. So again, we have the select components option down, so that way the whole plugin actually highlights. You'll see the two input points there. And you can't just do a right click and move. You actually need to move the work points themselves for the plugin to move. So I'm going to hold down Alt and I'm just going to window around those points there, and I'm going to move them from here in there. And again, we can still see that this isn't going to be able to work and that there's going to be a bolt clearance problem. Now, when you choose this by bolt option, basically what it's going to do is if I actually come in here to the bolt group and then I change the direction or rotation of this, so from back to front, what it'll do is it'll actually rotate the bolts around. Now we do need to come in here and we actually need to move this out again because this is now coming in from the wrong side. So let's just hold down Alt and we're going to window from those points. And the first point that you pick is actually going to be the point where the tip of the bolt is going to basically be. And in this particular case, this is a TC bolt. And so what we want to do is we want the spline to basically be shown here because it's a tension control bolt. So there's a chart that controls and looks at the diameter of the bolt and essentially what the length of that spline or the diameter of that spline is going to be. And so again, you can just continue to move these points until the bolt is in position, exactly representing whether or not there's going to be clearance or not. So again, here, I can now look at that bolt, select on it, and I can see that it could be inserted from this direction as long as this plate was basically moved up here along with the head of the bolt at the same time. Now, if we change the alignment based on points, and I just go ahead and say modify here, you'll notice that it goes back to the first 2 points that I had picked. And in fact, if I grab one of these points here and I just move it to some random location at a diagonal, you'll see that the bolt orientation actually changes and constantly follows that the alignment based on those 2 picking points. So in order for you to have complete control depending on which view you're in and how you're actually putting in the bolt in which direction, you can choose either to always be aligned by points or by the bolt itself. Okay, so now let's go ahead and take a look at whether or not we can get the wrench on there. So I'm going to switch this to wrench clearance. And again, these are just some starter dimensions. So you'll need to look up based on the bolt diameter, the type of bolt that you're working with, and see what are the dimensions of the actual TC gun. So this is important to probably ask the fabricator and erector at the beginning of the job. That way you can know exactly what you're going to input on here, and then you can save those settings away. So you'll see that there's some starter settings up at the top, but we could easily make different types of guns and take their names there and save those settings so that way you can easily load them up. Now let's go ahead and do this wrench clearance option. So when we're looking at this, essentially, again, we can do by points or by bolt. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to apply these settings and I'll activate the component again. Again, we'll pick our bolt. And then essentially here, I'm just picking I'm actually going to pick kind of probably, well, we'll start here and then I'll pick our second point to just get that wrench in, right? So you'll see that the wrench is kind of aligned in this direction. Well, what you can do is we can say 180 degrees, press modify, and then you'll see that the handle of that TC gun can be rotated. Or if you do 90 degrees, it just basically rotates around that alignment axis so that way you can see what you're doing. Now, when you modify this, what you can do is we can see that this is actually with the head of that wrench, or the socket is like fully like engaged on the head of that bolt. Now, let's go ahead and say that, well, in reality, we need to see what that's going to be further out. So if we kind of pull that out again, for some reason, there's a limitation on plugins where you actually have to grab the points and move them out. So again, we'll do that, and then we'll just move it out here. And so this theoretically is a little bit closer to what would really be happening. And in fact, there's going to again be a spline probably on that bolt, and we still have to clear even that. So again, just at a minimum, when you're looking at this, this shows you how you can insert a bolt insertion plugin on one side, and then you can put in the electronic wrench or TC gun or even a manual socket size and wrench just to check and see if there's clearance to actually tighten this bolt. Now, in the case where you can't use an electric wrench, there's actually different sizes of electric wrenches. There's a minimum clearance wrench, and then there's a standard TC gun, which is kind of what these dimensions are. But even minimum clearance TC guns for larger bolt diameters are still pretty large. They're actually about 6 to 8 inches like in length here coming off of the bolt. And so if these conditions don't work, then and you need a slip critical fully tensioned bolt, then sometimes what has to happen is they have to use what's called a hydraulic wrench out in the field, which is much slower, although it's much smaller and can get into really tight cases. So this is why it's important as the detailer to evaluate different types of connections, especially when you have so many bolts like this. And in this case, they need to be fully tensioned to slip critical. And so it's good to be aware of this, bring these issues up, and ask the project manager or fabricator and erector what their preferences are.